Welcome to SpeakUp Talks. I'm Travis, and today I'm joined by Emily Miner, Director of Data and Services at Ethisphere. Emily is also one of the experts behind Ethisphere's latest ethics and compliance program trends and employee perceptions report. Great to have you here, Emily.
Happy to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, about the conversation, so this report that we mentioned, it's a very comprehensive look into ethics and compliance programs worldwide, drawing on over 1.2 million employee responses across nearly 100 companies in 58 countries. And while reading the report, one part that stuck out to me the most was the statement that companies who commit to ethical business practices continue to deliver stronger long-term performance. And I really like this statement because it clearly articulates what we also believe here at SpeakUp, and that's that there's real business value and integrity. And the reason why I wanted to focus it more on this kind of conversation today is because I love how it translates the value of ethics compliance programs into the language of the board of directors, the language that they speak, which is financial performance. So Emily, let's take a moment to talk about the report, where these insights come from, and why it's helpful to frame ethics and compliance programs in this way.
Sure. Yeah. So for years at Ethisphere, we've built data sets that I think really prove strong ethics is good business. So you mentioned the employee surveys. We regularly conduct these surveys with organizations that measure their ethical culture. But what we also do is every year we run a massive program benchmarking effort. And the outcome of that is we recognize and honor exemplary practices with our World's Most Ethical Companies designation. And in 2025, like earlier this year, we recognized 136 organizations. So what we wanted to do with this report was kind of bring those two data sets together to provide a holistic picture of trends and leading practices in the business ethics space, complemented by employee perceptions and lived experience.
So I'm curious about ethics premium. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, but also where the data comes from, but also just why Ethisphere started tracking this in the first place?
Yeah, and I think that really ties back to your framing question around the connection to financial performance, and that's really what the ethics premium is designed to do. So just to define what we mean when we say ethics premium, thus it represents the margin by which publicly traded companies that are recognized in any given year as a world's most ethical company, the margin by which they outperformed a comparable index of global companies over, as you said, the preceding 5-year period. And it kind of has I think, an interesting origin story. So we first started looking at calculating the ethics premium a little over a decade ago, and it was largely in response to the economic crisis of the Great Recession back in 2008, 2009, 2010. And in that time period, we kept on hearing messages from business leaders like, we can't afford to focus on this right now, this being ethics and compliance. We'll get back to that once we've stabled the ship. So there seemed to be this perception that there's this inherent tension between, doing the right thing and making money. And we decided to test that perspective by looking at companies' share price, which is obviously publicly available metric of financial performance. And truthfully, we didn't know what we would find. We had already been conducting the world's most ethical companies process for a number of years. So the ethics premium came later. So we weren't really sure what we would find. But we decided to take a 5-year time horizon because it's a little bit more long-term. We wanted to avoid any false positive or negative connections that between a company's world's most ethical honoree status and an event in their share price that might be attributed to a specific jump or dip. So taking that 5-year time horizon kind of smooths it out a little bit, and we think provides a more reliable measure, really, of the long-term value creation of ethical business practice. So that's the origin story and kind of the methodology. And if we look at this year, the world's most ethical company ethics premium for this year is 7.8% above their comparable peers, which I think is really quite impressive given our economic climate. The number has varied year over year, but since we started it, it has always represented a statistically significant percentage of outperformance, which, we can't claim, and we're not claiming causation, but what we do know is that we have over 10 years of consistent correlation between world's most ethical companies outperforming their peers, which I think tells us something. And when you think about it, really, I think it makes common sense. The types of practices that would put a company on the WMEC list are those that mitigate risk, engage and unlock the potential of your people, protect tangible and intangible assets. So it makes intuitive sense that those companies would outperform financially, but the ethics premium, I think, really provides a quantitative measure exactly of that.
So, I mean, clearly, being ethical does lead to factors that make you more successful financially. But why do you think it's necessary to actually put these financial numbers into a statement kind of around the performance of ethical behavior? Why is this benchmark actually necessary for compliance teams?
That's certainly a fair question, because one could make the argument that the intrinsic value, like the value is intrinsic in and of itself, but I think just practically speaking, it is necessary to highlight that connection. In addition to combating that mentality of we can only do good when times are good, ethics and compliance as an industry really has evolved over the past decade plus. It's a relatively new corporate function, and for a long time operated really more as on the compliance side, box checking, control oriented, commonly referred to as the Department of No. And so, because of this, the way ethics and compliance operated back then, it was seen as a cost center. But times have changed and ethics and compliance programs have changed, with them. And I think there's been a significant shift across the world of business, and extending into ethics and compliance programs from a rules-based system to one that's based on values. Just as an aside, a large part of my role is assessing the maturity of companies' ethics and compliance programs. And so I speak to ethics and compliance leaders all the time. And something that I hear again and again, I've been working in this space for almost 15 years, and this was not the case when I first started in the industry. But now something that I hear again and again is that, it's my job as an ethics and compliance professional to learn and understand my business, how the business works, what the business goals are, and then to figure out how to design programs and processes that support the achievement of those goals in the right way, aligned to our values. And so, I think ethics and compliance programs are so much more successful when they can speak that language of business, are responsive to the needs of business, and highlighting that connection between business ethics and financial performance is a really large part of that, and is a really large contributor to the spirit of partnership between ethics and compliance in the business.
So if I could maybe summarize what you're saying here. So it seems that ethics and compliance has shifted from more of a just being seen as a cost center or check the box to more of a cost saver. And I think now we're starting to see it shift more towards a competitive advantage. Is that something you would agree with?
Absolutely. And I like how you kind of finished that by talking about competitive advantage, because I think the value of operating with integrity does more than saves cost. I think it really does propel growth. It protects reputation. So that shift, kind of my one of my personal favorite ways of marking that shift over the past few decades of ethics compliance is, this is a little sort of a silly parameter perhaps, but it's looking at how the titles of people that lead these programs have changed. And it started out as chief compliance officer. That's back to that kind of box checking. Are you in compliance? Yes or no? Paper list mentality, to chief compliance and ethics officer. So we're adding a little bit in of that, behavior element, and then swapping the words, chief ethics and compliance officer, which I think signals the growing importance of ethics. And now I work with leaders whose titles are chief ethics officer, chief integrity officer. We're not even talking about compliance anymore, because of course we are, but in terms of what a title signifies, and it's really because if you have ethics, if you have integrity, compliance follows as a result. So let's design for the former rather than the latter.
Yeah, interesting. So, I think obviously over time regulations obviously change, and how would you say that regulation has kind of played a role in not only making ethics and compliance more visible and valued, but also the more ethics side of it? And as you just mentioned.
Yeah, it certainly has played a role. And, I think there's a little bit of a delayed effect here. As with so many emerging areas, let's take AI, regulation has to kind of catch up, right? The thing happens first, and then we design regulatory frameworks around it. And so regulation, I think, had to catch up with where ethics and compliance was, and where it is going. Regulatory frameworks were more focused on that compliance aspect, when in practice the programs had extended beyond that to the more ethics side. But I would say that regulation certainly has caught up now, and is now even pushing forward practices in many ways too. So to answer your question about the role that regulation has played in raising ethics and compliance visibility and value, just there's so many different examples, but regulatory frameworks in the US, where I'm based, in the UK, in France, many other places, they kind of, one of the common features is that they all very clearly describe senior leadership's responsibility for establishing a culture of compliance. And so there's this placement of accountability in the regulatory guidance. And we see that exercised in enforcement actions too, where leaders are held accountable for the missteps of their organization, often the missteps that they themselves have taken in their organizations. And there's the expectation now from regulators that the ethics and compliance has direct access to the board. There's reporting to the board. They expect ethics and compliance to have the appropriate resources needed to, do their job well. There's so many different examples. And I think also not just the specific regulatory expectations and requirements, but how they've proliferated has also played a role in raising ethics and compliance profile, because one of the main challenges that I hear from business ethics and compliance leaders these days is how increasingly complex the regulatory landscape is. Like if you're a company that operates in 30 countries, you probably have 35 different regulatory requirements with which to comply. And, that's a little bit of a joke. But the point is that one place where I've seen ethics and compliance add a lot of value is in helping their companies take a systems mindset to operating within this regulatory complexity. And, rather than chasing after each new regulation, adopting a new policy because this country has come out with something, taking that systems mindset and building governance, building controls, building management systems that align fundamentally with the how the company chooses to do business. And that's a much more stable approach than just companies being reactive. Like, it allows companies to be proactive. I think we saw this conversation a lot earlier this year when the administration in the United States announced that they were going to pause enforcement of the FCPA, which is a major anti-bribery act. And so that's a shift in regulatory priority. But what we heard time and time again is companies saying, this doesn't change anything about how we operate. We don't do business through bribes and corruption. We do business with integrity. And so who knows what will happen in a few years when there's a new administration in the United States, like what will the FCPA kind of be back on? So rather than blowing with that wind of regulatory change, taking that more principles-based, systems-based approach helps companies navigate regulatory complexity, and it's ethics and compliance that are the ones leading that charge in their organizations. And so I think that's also contributing to the elevation of the function in their organizations.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think it definitely really portrays that change from reactive to proactivity very well. Obviously, in an ideal world, ethics and compliance teams would be seen primarily in this light and seen as value creators, but obviously that's not always the case. So I guess what kind of advice would you try to give a compliance leader trying to shift their program from being seen as maybe reactive checkbox compliance to being perceived more as proactive value creators?
I think it goes back to thinking of yourself as a business partner, and that really does represent a fundamental shift in the kind of the identity of ethics and compliance. It's easy to say those words, but I think it really is. It takes more to put that into practice. So I don't see this as kind of flippant advice. So thinking of yourself as a business partner, how can you help protect the company's reputation while also supporting its growth? Not forgetting that last part, which I think wasn't always thought of, as much 10 years ago. It was just got to protect the company's but we need both. Like, for a company to thrive and to stay in existence, we also have to support its growth, right? So what insights can you, as an ethics and compliance leader, what insights can you bring to the business to help them do their jobs better, to help them be more insightful? Maybe it's trends that you're seeing in the hotline related to a specific, business line or location, and what that might tell them. Where can you create efficiency for the business, such as by designing and targeting processes and controls based on risk levels, rather than just, indiscriminately across the board, like everybody has to go through this onerous process when we are, engaging with a customer or bringing on a significant a supplier, like being a little more nuanced in the application of those controls and processes so that it makes sense. And I think that, storytelling, leveraging data, those are also impactful means of engagement. There's, of course, any number of headlines out there on compliance failures, on toxic culture. So, take your pick and ask, how could this happen here? How well prepared are we to prevent this from happening? And engage leadership in those conversations. And on the data side, benchmarking yourself against other programs, that's also really powerful, because it's not just, you saying, hey, we should be doing this thing, or, whatever, but actually comparing ourselves to our industry peers or to leading organizations, like whatever the parameter is. This is kind of where companies are going, and we're a little bit behind, or maybe we're a little bit ahead. Highlighting those areas of strength, those gaps, that can also be really powerful. That comparative, the comparative angle, I think, also really helps to kind of put a program and their priorities into a broader context that's important.
Yeah, so I think not only externally comparing yourselves to other programs, but also internally. Basically, I think if you just say that if you can manage it, if you can measure it, you can manage it. Is that fairly accurate, you'd say?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that. I love that saying. I think I think it holds true in so many different examples. And, ethics and compliance, kind of going back to the shift from compliance to ethics and all of that, I think that one of the areas where I think companies can be really effective in that ethos of if you measure it, you can manage it, is culture, ethical culture. We've been talking a little bit about the controls and the systems. At the end of the day, if you don't have the culture that supports the policies that you have in place and the idea that you've put in place about, who we are as an organization and our values, like if the culture doesn't support that or match up with that, if the leadership doesn't support that and match up with that, people will always find a way to go around, to circumvent the rules. And so I say that to highlight the importance of culture, and also to connect back to your idea that if you can measure it, you can manage it. And you can measure culture. We talked at the beginning about the employee surveys that form one of the data sets that underpin our trends report. There's many other ways to keep a finger on the pulse of your culture, but it's through measuring behavior and leadership and perception and experience that organizations can intentionally shape their culture. And so, we advocate very strongly that compliance leaders should track and report on these culture metrics and report on them to the boards, to their board, to their executive leadership teams. Like, it's not just, it's not just about hotline reports, but so many other factors, including ethical culture.
Definitely. So tracking progress, benchmarking, super important here, not only for helping convince maybe budget holders or the board of directors, but also just to measure the performance of your program. So super important. Emily, before we wrap up, I would just like to ask if there's one piece of advice you could give to ethics and compliance leaders based on this year's report, what would it be?
I think it's to find your community. There's a saying that I've heard often, so I will not take credit for this saying. I'm certainly repeating what I've heard, but that there's no competition in compliance. A rising tide really does lift all ships. So, if you have a problem, a challenge that you're working through, you're trying to figure out how to get your board to pay more attention, whatever it is, you're trying to, rethink your third-party risk management system, chances are someone else has gone through that. They've got some great tactics, or they have some hard lessons that they've learned that you can benefit from. So I think the number one piece of advice is to find your community. So, LinkedIn, conferences, webinars, there are a lot of ways to get connected. And, to that end, I encourage anyone listening to check out ethisphere.com. We have an events page, and we have free webinars. We have roundtable discussions. We have an annual Global Ethics Summit, all great ways to tap into the collective excellence of this community.
Great. Well, great advice. And Emily, thank you for the great chats. And also, thank you so much for just joining us today and sharing the insights.
It was a
And also,
pleasure.
I just want to say thank you to everyone listening. And until next time.